events of the Civil War fell silent 156 years ago, yet many Americans remain fascinated with the war that had so many names depending upon where you lived and grew up. One of my favorites was overheard in Southern Virginia, the recent unpleasantness, and I highlight the word recent. But why do we care about a war that ended so long ago? Well, I think part of it is the continental scope of a conflict fought on not some foreign shore, but on battlefields ranging from Pennsylvania to New Mexico, Florida to Kansas, hallowed ground in over half of this country, which can be easily visited. Part, I think, is the near mythological figures from the war that intrigue us still. Lincoln, Robert E. Lee, Grant, Stonewall Jackson, William Sherman, Bedford Forrest, Clara Barton, who started the Red Cross. But perhaps most important is the sheer drama of the story, the momentous issues at stake, and the tragic, awe-inspiring costs. A quarter of the country in ruin, 750,000 dead, more than all of our wars combined. And that figure keeps revising upward. I was taught in school it was 600,000, but it keeps coming up. And if you put that in today's figures, it would be 7 million people dead. Well, how had it come to this? It settled the two festering questions that our founding fathers had to leave unresolved in order to get the Constitution ratified. Whether the nation, dedicated to equality, could exist half slave and half free, and whether we could remain one nation indivisible. But did the resolution of these two monumental issues require a civil war to resolve? Well, many historians think so, but the British Empire abolished slavery in 1831, freeing almost 1 million enslaved Africans in the Caribbean and other British colonies. Could we have profited from learning more about why and how Britain resolved their slavery issue before it became irrepressible? The fact we didn't may have some relevance to the growing divisiveness, polarization, and inability to find common ground that grips our nation today. So let's turn back the clock and look at the factors and attitudes that led to our own Civil War. I'm going to let Professor Gallagher do that, but as he does, watch for how the North and the South developed along different economic and cultural models and the impact of that. Watch for the difference in religion and social attitudes. Watch for how territorial expansion would poison national politics. Watch for the two events in 1831, the year that Britain freed its slaves, that hardened the growing animosities in our country. Watch for the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin in both the North and the South. Watch for the fisticuffs in the U.S. Senate in 1856. And finally, watch for the Dred Scott decision by the Supreme Court in 1857. Many looked to the court as the last hope that would be above the sectional controversy. That it came down squarely on the side of the South and slavery was the death knell of resolution short of war. The newly formed Republican Party called for closing off all the territories to slavery. It also favored abolition. It nominated Abraham Lincoln for president in the 1860 election. Upon Lincoln's victory, Southern states began seceding from the United States. That alone guaranteed a civil war to restore the Union, but the underlying cause all along would be the slavery issue.
48 lectures exploring various aspects of the American Civil War. Although 48 may seem to be a large number, we'll be able to do no more than scratch the surface of a subject so vast, complex, important, and engaging that it has inspired a literature that conservatively runs to more than 50,000 books and pamphlets. More than one book or pamphlet a day has been published since April 1861, when the firing on Fort Sumter helped precipitate the conflict. The course will provide a narrative thread supplemented by a number of lectures that look at topical aspects of the war. We'll devote considerable attention to both the military and the civilian spheres, and we'll take time for brief biographical sketches of several dozen key actors. We'll not be able to spend much time on the coming of the war, and we'll look at Reconstruction only within its wartime context, the beginning of the process of Reconstruction that took place while the war was still raging. Now, both the coming of the war and Reconstruction easily could be the subject of separate courses, but we're not going to be able to spend that much time on them. Having said that, I'll add that some background is necessary to set the stage for the war, and that's what we'll do in this first lecture. Time prevents our employing anything but the broadest of brushstrokes, and I'll say at the outset that we should not fall into the trap of trying to understand the outbreak of fighting by bringing everything we know to our consideration of why the war came. Most Americans did not wake up every morning during the antebellum years thinking only about sectional tensions. They didn't wake up with the first thought in their minds what's going on in the North or what's going on in the South. They got on with their lives. They were concerned with the type of mundane activities that occupy our attention most of the time. They didn't know that a gigantic war lurked a few years ahead, and thus they generally had no sense of time ticking away for a young republic destined to undergo a trauma of unimagined proportion. They often looked, for example, at local or state rather than national politics as their main focus when they were engaged in the political system. Yet we can trace the unfolding of sectional tensions that contributed to a situation where war could come in 1861. And in this lecture, we'll first look at the ways in which the North and South developed along different paths in the 4 decades before the conflict erupted. Then we'll see how the issue of territorial expansion into the federal lands in the West proved especially poisonous. And finally, we will look very briefly at some of the mileposts along the road to sectional disruption. There's been a great deal of debate among historians about whether the North and South had developed by the midpoint of the 19th century into societies that were different from one another. Some scholars have argued that they had become essentially 2 different civilizations, divided across a fault line delineated by the institution of slavery. Other scholars point to a common language, a common history, most obviously the struggle for independence in the late 18th century, and other shared characteristics, and these scholars insist that differences were minor compared to commonalities between Northerners and Southerners. I believe much of this debate misses a major point, and that is that most Americans, in my view, by the mid-1850s at the latest, believed that there were major differences between Northerners and Southerners, white Northerners and white Southerners. Northerners looked south and saw people made different by slavery. Many white Southerners, I would say most, in turn, considered Northerners an almost alien people, bent on interfering with Southern society. The key thing to understand is that it doesn't matter whether there were really major differences. If the people thought there were and acted accordingly, that is the most important thing. And I believe that was the case. People looked north if they were in the South and saw a people they believed was different, and the same thing happened in the other direction. It's always risky to generalize about large groups of people, whether in the United States or anywhere else. But I think it is possible to make some generalizations about the 2 sections. All these generalizations could be qualified. There are always exceptions to everything that I'm going to say, but let's plow ahead fearlessly and make some generalizations about each side, starting with the North. The North was increasing far more rapidly in population during the antebellum decades than was the South. There was more immigration by far. was a far more urban area, although certainly not an urban area by our modern standards. It was far more developed commercially and industrially than the South was. There was also a very strong agricultural sector in the North. 40% or more of the entire labor force in the North was engaged in agriculture. But it was far more urban, far more commercial, far more industrial than the South. And if we had to pick out the single dominant element of the northern population, it would be what we would probably call yeoman farmers, independent farmers who worked their own land, relatively small parcels of land. The North had a strong strain of Yankee Protestantism that urged citizens to be thrifty and to work hard and to avoid alcohol or excess of any kind. Now again, not all Northerners fit into this pattern. There were millions of Catholics in the North, many Irish Catholics, German Catholics in cities and elsewhere. There were many non-Catholics who lived especially in the southern regions of the North, what was called the Little Egypt region of the Midwest down along the Ohio River, who did not subscribe to this notion of Yankee Protestantism. But among the political and economic leaders of the North, Yankee Protestantism was very strong. And this strain of Protestantism helped fuel economic expansion and pointed the way toward an emerging capitalist, industrial, and commercial giant. The North also embraced reform movements. Again, these were supported in a major way by this strain of Yankee Protestantism, this Yankee Protestant ethic. Temperance was a major reform movement in the North. Public education, and most important, abolitionism. What historians call the free labor ideology had taken strong hold in the North by the mid-1850s. An ideology that argued that there is no inherent antagonism between labor on the one hand and capital on the other, that argued an individual could begin owning nothing but his labor, and they would have put it within the context of his labor, nothing but his labor, work, use that labor to acquire a small amount of capital and eventually become a member of the middle class or even more. Abraham Lincoln was a perfect example of this, someone who began with virtually nothing but his labor and ended up as a very successful member of the middle class. The Republican Party believed fervently in the notion of a free labor society. Many in the North looked south and saw a section that they believed was holding the nation back. They saw a land of lazy, cruel, violent people who did not subscribe to the ideas that would make the United States great. That is the view many in the North had of the South. Let's shift to the South now. The South was losing ground in population and thus clout in Congress. The railroad, canal, and road networks in the South were underdeveloped compared to those in the North. Cities were fewer and smaller. New Orleans at 160,000 people, plus or minus a few in 1860, was by far the largest city in the South. There were many cities in the North that dwarfed most of the cities in the South. The South was overwhelmingly agricultural. 80% of its labor force engaged in agriculture. The vast majority of Southern wealth was invested in land and in slaves. Wealthier slaveholders dominated the region politically and socially, and their lands produced key cash crops. They produced cotton and sugar and tobacco and rice. Cotton was the key. Cotton fed Northern and European textile industries. Cotton exports alone gave the United States a favorable balance of trade in the 1850s. Southern religion was also, of course, predominantly Protestant, overwhelmingly Protestant, but it was a more personal kind of Protestantism, concerned less with reforming or improving society and more with individual salvation. Reform movements did not really take root in the South. There's very little of the temperance movement. There is virtually no abolitionist sentiment in the South, at least not spoken sentiment by the 1850s, really even before that. Education lagged far behind Northern standards across most of the South. Now, many white Southerners looked to the North as a region of cold, grasping people who cared little about family and subordinated everything to the process of making money. Slavery was not only a form of labor control in the South, but also the key to the South's social system. Only about a quarter of white Southern families owned slaves, and most of those held 5 or fewer. Only 12% of the slaveholders, that is 12% of the 25% who owned slaves, had 12 or more slaves, which is one way to divide slaveholders between relatively large and more modest slaveholders. All Southern white people, however, had a stake in the system of slavery because as white people, they were automatically part of the controlling class in the South. No matter how poor they were, how wretched their condition might be, they were superior in their minds and according to the legal and social structures of their society to the millions of enslaved African Americans among them. In an ironic way, all Southern whites, regardless of economic status, were made equal by the fact of slavery. For this reason, and because there was genuine fear of what would happen if large numbers of free black people were to be set loose, as they would put it, to live among them, Southern whites, almost all of them, saw slavery as a necessary and generally good institution. And they reacted very defensively when Northerners attacked it. Now, I think it's important to separate notions about slavery from notions about race. Most white Southerners were intensely racist. Most white Northerners were intensely racist during the mid-19th century. The difference was virtually all of the black people in the United States lived in the South at this time. I mean, virtually all of them lived in the South. Whenever enough black people would congregate someplace in the North to pose a threat to the white population of that area, white Northerners often responded almost precisely as white Southerners did. So do not assume that racism is somehow a Southern phenomenon during the 19th century. It's national. So there are differences between the North and the South and the way they're developing. Let's move on and look at the question of expansion into new federal territories and how it became an especially aggravating question. The South was aware of the fact, obviously, that the North was outstripping it in population. The House of Representatives, clearly dominated by the North well before the Civil War, because, as you know, that's representation based on population there. The Senate was something the South tried to maintain parity, and we'll talk about more about that in just a minute. But because the South knew the North was outstripping it in population, the white Southerners believed it was necessary on their part to do anything possible to try to erect safeguards to their social system and the ability of their social system to expand. In other words, the ability of slavery to expand. And one of the ways to do that was to try to keep parity in the Senate, as I said. Now, the North is equally aware of its preponderance of population. It believed, since there were more people in the North should have more clout in the United States. There are more of us. Why should we not be able to do what we want to do if we outnumber, and increasingly outnumber, the South? White Southerners felt that the peculiar institution, as they called slavery, had to go into new federal territories where their economy would stagnate. They'd be caught in a situation where slavery was boxed in. Slave populations would grow in that area, and it would be a problem potentially not only socially, but also economically. Northerners, on the other hand, increasingly came to call for territories being reserved for free men only, who would work their own farms. The Free Soil movement that gained strength through the 1840s and 1850s argued for this. Reserve the Western territories for free men. Many of these Northerners, calling for free soil in the West, I will emphasize, couldn't care less about the black people who were caught in slavery. They wanted free soil for white men in the West. They didn't want free soil for black freed slaves in the West. They wanted the territories reserved for white men. So this was an issue. Whether or not slavery would be allowed to expand into the territories that became a greater and greater and greater area of dispute between the sections as we go toward 1860. And of course, it was the problem because the United States was acquiring more and more land as we go toward 1860. Let's shift now to some of the key mileposts along the road of sectional friction. Now, most of these, I suspect, are very familiar to you, but we'll go through some of the more important ones just to have them fresh in your minds. And again, I don't want to convey by going through this list of sectional tensions that there was a sense beginning in 1820 or so that we're pointing toward an inevitable civil war. All of these things are just leading to a point where we're going to be killing each other. Most people did not believe that. Some would argue that, but that isn't the main thing on everybody's mind. Nonetheless, these things occurred, and they upped the level of tensions, and they made more possible an explosion at some point. Let's start in 1820 with the Missouri Compromise. It restricted slavery in the old Louisiana Purchase country to land below the 3630 line. It allowed Missouri to come in as a slave state, and Missouri would be balanced by Maine very shortly thereafter, coming in as a free state. Until 1850, free states and slave states would alternate coming into the Union, which preserved the balance of power in the Senate. So for 30 years after the Missouri Compromise, you'll have states essentially coming in pairs in the United States, one slave and one free. 1831, two major events. The first was the most important slave rebellion in the United States history, Nat Turner's insurrection or rebellion in Southside Virginia, where Nat Turner, a black preacher, and a handful of followers rose up and killed several dozen white people, hacked some of them to death, killed others, sent an enormous shock across the white South. This is, of course, a great Southern nightmare, slaves rising up and slaughtering masters. That same year, 1831, William Lloyd Garrison began publication of The Liberator, which would become the most famous abolitionist newspaper. That also set off alarms in the South. Here's somebody publishing a newspaper, getting a lot of attention, saying all of our slave property should be swept away, both in 1831. There was a nullification controversy in South Carolina that really spread over from the very late 1820s into the early 1830s, ostensibly about the tariff, but really about slavery, I believe, and whether the federal government, if it were given power in the area of tariffs, might not step in and interfere with state institutions such as slavery later on, a fear of too much federal power. In 1840, the Liberty Party first ran a presidential candidate. The Liberty Party had one issue: the end of slavery. The admission of Texas to the Union in 1845 and then the Mexican War in 1846 to 47 brought vast new western lands into the nation that fanned the conflict, the sectional conflict, during the 1840s. In response to these huge new areas brought in, and they included California and Utah, or what are now California, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, and parts of Colorado and Nevada. In response to all of these lands coming in, the North staked out a clear position with the 1846 Wilmot Proviso, offered by a Democrat from Pennsylvania, named, interestingly enough, David Wilmot. Wilmot's proviso said, all right, we'll take all this land from Mexico, we'll bring all of this land into the Union, but we will bar slavery from any lands acquired as a result of the war with Mexico. That passed in the Northern-dominated House of Representatives. The Wilmot Proviso did, but it was voted down in the Senate. It gave a clear warning to the South of the intention of a good part of the North to seal off new territories to slavery. Many people in the North, even some Democrats, said white Southerners like David Wilmot want to keep our slave property out of the territories. A crisis followed crisis fairly rapidly after 1848, a year in which the Free Soil Party ran a presidential candidate in a major effort. The Free Soil Party, obviously, for keeping slavery out of the territories. The Compromise of 1850, which together with the Missouri Compromise is one of the two most famous efforts in the antebellum years to dampen sectional tensions and animosities. Compromise of 1850 arose in response to a number of issues, and it really consisted of a cluster of pieces of legislation that didn't really please anybody, but did manage to quiet things down for a while. Key elements of the compromise: California came in as a free state, and that broke parity in the Senate. From the admission of California forward, the North would control the Senate as well as the House of Representatives. On the southern side, the compromise included a very tough fugitive slave law that put the United States government in the position of having to help slave owners recover slaves who managed to run away to free territory. So much of the North wasn't happy with the fugitive slave law. Much of the South not happy with California coming in as a free state under the Compromise of 1850. 2 years later, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it really is impossible, I think, for us to grasp the effect that Uncle Tom's Cabin had. It was an enormous bestseller. It sold hundreds of thousands of copies very quickly, and that is at a time when the nation had only about 25 million people. It sold thousands of copies overseas as well. It really did bring home to a vastly increased proportion of the white North some notion about the awful situation of black people living under slavery. Many Northerners who really hadn't cared before became sensitive to the issue because of Uncle Tom's Cabin and Harriet Beecher Stowe. There's a wonderful story about Abraham Lincoln meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe during the Civil War. It may be apocryphal, but it may not. He is introduced to her, and he said also, this is the young lady who brought on this great Civil War. Her book did have a good deal to do with increasing, in some ways, sectional tensions. It was a book loathed in the South. In fact, a couple of novels in the South were written as answers to Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a very important book. I think easily the most important novel in American history. 2 years after Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was passed, which included a provision for popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty meant that the people of a territory should decide for themselves whether or not they would want slavery in their territory. Don't let Congress decide. Let the people who are living there decide. It was the brainchild, to a degree, of Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, although the notion had come up earlier. Lewis Cass had brought it up back in the campaign of 1848. Many Northerners said this violates the Missouri Compromise. This means that you're going to potentially open up some areas to slavery, some of the territories that the Missouri Compromise had said would be closed to slavery forever. It went beyond the stage of just debating this. There was tremendous violence associated with Kansas, Nebraska, as pro-slavery people and anti-slavery people fought and killed each other in Kansas and along the Kansas-Missouri border. There was virtually a minor civil war that broke out to win control of the area. 1856, one of the more dramatic things that ever happened on the floor of either the House or the Senate occurred when Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, after giving a powerful speech condemning what he called the crime against Kansas, that is, perhaps allowing slavery into Kansas, was caned on the floor of the Senate by Preston Brooks, the representative from South Carolina. Beaten into insensibility, literally, covered with blood, collapsed on the floor. Charles Sumner, who was an abolitionist, left the Senate for 3 years as a result of this beating, and Massachusetts left his seat vacant. So there was Charles Sumner's empty seat in the Senate. A constant reminder, said people in the North, to the brutality and tendency toward violence on the part of white Southerners. In the white South, they reacted by sending new canes to Preston Brooks and saying that he had upheld the honor of the South against a man who not only was impugning the whole region in his speech, but also had attacked personally a relative of Preston Brooks's. So the caning of Sumner, a major national event. That's 1856. In 1857, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in our history was decided. The Dred Scott decision, handed down by the Supreme Court, presided over by Roger B. Taney. The Dred Scott decision, in effect, said that no black person could be a citizen. Said that the Missouri Compromise violated the Fifth Amendment's prohibition against taking property from people without due process. That is, by saying someone couldn't take their slave property into part of the old Louisiana Purchase country, and also in effect said that Congress must protect slave property. What was at issue was the case of a slave named Dred Scott, who was taken to free territory by his master, who then returned to slave territory. The question was whether Scott should become free, because he had lived on free territory. The Tawney court said no. And this case alienated a significant part of the North. The abolitionists in the North went absolutely crazy about this. They said this is a perfect example of how a slave power conspiracy controls our government. The court, the Supreme Court, which should be standing above special interest, has here waded in directly on the side of the slave owners, said people in the North. And that, they argue, is a bad situation. The slave power conspiracy, they said, is holding sway even though we outnumber them, and we're outnumbering them more and more. Something is wrong here. We have to curb this conspiracy. Part of the problem as we move through the 1840s and 50s is that the national institutions that generally have been looked to bring the nation together were failing. The churches split over the issue of slavery, many of them dividing in the 1840s and later. We get Northern Baptists and Southern Baptists, Northern Methodists and Southern Methodists, rather than just Baptists and Methodists. The Whig and Democratic parties broke down. Those parties had been national parties, also tending to hold things together because the parties would try to find compromises so they would have voters in both North and South. The second party system, the Whigs and Democrats, the first party system had been the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans. This second national party system broke down under the strain of sectionalism. The Whigs ran their last serious presidential candidate in 1852. And the Democratic Party became an almost completely Southern-dominated sectional party as well, most of its national policies favoring the South. The Republican Party first ran a candidate in 1856, the Army officer and famous explorer John C. Fremont. The Republican Party is a sectional party. It has no appeal in the South, none. Its platform called for the banning of slavery from the territories. In Southern minds, the Republicans quickly became associated with abolitionists, though the two were by no means synonymous. But the party system then is breaking down. The national parties are no longer in influence holding things together, just as the churches are not. And finally, many people had grasped that the Supreme Court is the last hope for an institution that really would be above the sectional controversy, but Dred Scott showed that that was not the case either. Many in the North worried that they were almost hopeless in the face of this powerful slaveholding influence in the nation. They would point even to Northern men who were powerful politicians. Franklin Pierce, president, a Democratic president from New Hampshire. James Buchanan, a Democratic president from Pennsylvania. But their policies were all pro-Southern, said many in the North who opposed them, Republicans and others. They're dough faces. That was the expression, the derisive expression applied to what were called Northern men of Southern principles. These are Northern men doing the bidding of their Southern masters, said many who opposed them. And here's a key element in the whole sectional controversy. Perceptions on each side had reached a point by the mid-1850s that scarcely allowed many Northerners and Southerners to view the other section in anything like sympathetic or even realistic terms. Each side expected the worst from the other. The white South looked north and saw a nation of abolitionists trying to kill the institution that was the foundation of the South's economic and social order. The North looked south and saw a land of aggressive slaveholders who, through the national courts and with dough-faced allies in Congress and the White House, frustrated the nation's progress in the modern world. There isn't much common ground, in a sense, as we move toward the end of the 1850s. I'll close with the observation that by 1859, a great many people, both North and South, had worked themselves into such a state that compromise would be very difficult if another great crisis did arise. When the election of 1860 brought to power a party that had called for closing off the territories to to slavery, the Republican Party, just such a crisis had arrived, and how each side dealt with that crisis will be the subject of our next lecture.
No. Let's try doing this. I don't know what's going to do now. If Ron didn't turn the lights on, we'll get a discussion going here a little bit. Thank you for that. Well, a couple of takeaways for me, and then we'll open it up. Did you notice that I think very insightful observation that perceptions became more important than reality in the prelude to the Civil War? An insight I think we might do well to ponder for our present discord. Facts are sometimes inconvenient, but they are crucial to any kind of civil discourse and politics and compromise. In our modern, technological-driven world, does history matter? Yeah, I really think it matters more and more. So often, we ignore the wisdom of history and repeat the same mistakes. Valuable indeed are leaders who know history and utilize it to apply the lessons of history to make decisions in the present and plan for the future. The prelude to the Civil War can tell us much, I think, about where we find ourselves today: a bitterly divided, polarized nation, dysfunctional political system, where heated rhetoric drowns out civil discourse, where many people seek out only news media they agree with, meaning they get affirmation, not information. Our current polarization is not north versus south, but it is in part urban versus rural, and it is somewhat cultural and social, continuity versus change, and change being gradual or quick. It's difficult to envision another full-blown civil war, but we have witnessed a violent insurrection at the very heart of our government. It's easy to see stagnation and deadlock leading to more threats and actual violence, which I cannot imagine anyone would desire or think productive, even those who feel driven to unleash it. Thus, the prelude to war, the irrepressible conflict that came to be resolved by a catastrophic civil war. I think it continues to be highly relevant and learning from its lessons. Well, I'm going to get a mic going here. Comments, observations on what we heard today, what we're seeing today, and how it fits. Larry, I can usually count on you for something. And you don't need a microphone.
I don't need the microphone. If you haven't, I urge you to read Kathleen Parker's column in today's Observer. I urge that for two reasons. One, of course, I always thought of her as a conservative columnist, and she had some strong words to say about the Republican Party and its future. And the other reason for reading it is because her choice of words to describe what's happening, I think, is great. But it fits the situation here. The question, she doesn't use the term rhino, but others certainly do. And the question is, who are the rhinos?
It's interesting how words matter. Words matter. And some people can sum up a situation where you think, wow. Yeah. Any other comments, observations? Ron, let me get you the mic, hold it right to your face.
Well, I have two things. One, I appreciated his focus on the expansion into the West, because that has much more of an influence, I think, than I had ever known. And actually, there's three things, because one thing I've been surprised about, maybe there are people that I still like.
We left off in our last lecture with Abraham Lincoln and the Republicans triumphant in the presidential canvass of 1860. The great question facing the United States in mid-November 1860, and the topic that we'll take up in this lecture, is how would the South react to the verdict?
Well, I was just
We have a
about,
whole new system, and I am not used to it, so Ron, continue on.
I still run into people that will firmly insist that slavery was not the part of that it was either the over influence of the industrialists in the North, or it was states' rights, and that there was no slavery had anything to do with it. It always just surprises me at this stage of the game that was it. The one thing that was new information, and I don't know whether I accept it as true, his statement that people in the North and people in the South each thought the other was so very different from them, and perhaps that they had this animosity. And I just don't see if I've ever run into that concept before.
Yes, you will find historians that like to debate, was it states' rights that drove this war, or was it slavery? And I think back to Larry, you remember this, when Calhoun was at dinner with Andrew Jackson and they had toast, and Calhoun says, "To states' rights so dear," Senator from South Carolina, and Jackson looks him right in the eye and says, "To the Union, it must and will be preserved." So there is that part, but most of the historians that I'm familiar with think at the very bottom of this thing, if you had to pick a cause, it was the leftover issue from the drafting of the Constitution. Can we exist half slave and half free? Yeah. I thought it was interesting, the fight to maintain parity in the Senate, and how important the Senate seems to be becoming more and more over the importance of the House. Yeah. Any other comments, observations? Blair?
If you're going to comment on that, just think of Green in the House of Representatives.
Good point. Good point. They know how to make the news. Oh my, oh my. I think we need to have some hot chocolate and a cookie. Well, all right. By the way, if any of you did not get a copy of what we'll be doing each month for the rest of the year, well, there are copies up here. And once again, these come from the class themselves. In December, we take a preference poll, and so it is the class who chooses what topics they'd like to cover. Joanne, were you saying something? Oh, okay. I thought you were. Well, Shirley, were you? No?
No, I think there were voices outside.
Oh. All right. Yep, let me get the mic to you because nobody will hear you otherwise. Hold it right up to your mouth.
Sorry. I don't recall the specifics, but in today's headlines, I heard of the Observer how many more white people are getting the COVID vaccines than the minority people. Oh, that surprised me. Sorry.
I can't explain that, but I do read that many of the African Americans are very suspicious of the COVID. Blair, you got any background on that or what that's all about?
Well, it goes back to Tuskegee.
Yeah.
Ah, those experiments. Yeah.
You trust your government.
Yeah. History comes back to bite us, doesn't it? Bad decisions add up, and they add up badly. Yeah, all right. Well, as always, thanks for coming. We'll see you in March.
saw you nodding your head. You read the column?
Oh, I read her in the Washington Post, I think it was the day before.
Oh.
We get the Post and the Times online.
Ah, okay.
No, she just really, she's glad we just had to say that.
Oh, I'll tell you, she was a place to do it.
Thank you for being here. See if I can figure out how to turn this video camera off now.
Well, you're doing much better than this week. We've had several problems with this from different groups. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Dave.
Have a good day.
No, I said, did Charlotte win her game on Sunday? No, it's okay.
Jane was saying they were out there in the rain and the
Oh,
cold,
oh.
you know, and no, nothing good happened.
Oh,
They lost by 2 goals.
oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah, because goals are not easy to get to make to
No,
begin
they're
with.
not
And to
at all.
lose by 2. Ouch.
Okay,
Good to see you, Dave.
thank you.